Good evening, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for being here this evening, where we will be discussing Mohammed Amer Meziane's book, The States of the Earth, An Ecological and Racial History of Secularization, which appeared in April in translation published by Verso. So this is an instance of that new genre called the book launch. Although it is, when we started thinking about it in the department, about what form to give this, Mohammed was very clear about saying that he did not want to have some symbolic honorific spectacle in his honor. He wanted a colloquium across the humanities. So I think it's very appropriate that we're holding this event in the Andrews Hall and that we've gathered colleagues from such a broad spectrum of disciplines here to speak to this project and to think together about its implications and where it puts us, having read this incredible study. So without further ado, I will introduce David Wills, who will be moderating this evening. And I believe the questions will be held for the very end. And so again, welcome. Thank you for being here. And I look forward to the proceedings.
Okay, thank you, Virginia. Let me add my word of thanks to all of you for being here. Virginia has announced our reason for being. So I will just let me just say that the book, The States of the Earth, An Ecological and Racial History of Secularization, which was translated by Jonathan Adjemian, is a translation of a book that appeared in French, Les Empires sous la Terre, 3 years ago, by our recently arrived colleague. We can still call you a new colleague, Mohammed Amer Meziane, whose book we're very happy to showcase this afternoon. So let me introduce the people on the panel in alphabetical order. And next to Mohammed is Holly Case, historian of modern Europe, focusing on the relationship between foreign policy, social policy, science, and literature. She's professor of European history here at Brown. Next to her, Bathsheba Demuth, a writer and environmental historian specializing in the lands and seas of the Russia and North American Arctic. She's Dean's Associate Professor of History and Environment and Society and Director of Native American and Indigenous Studies, the Native American and Indigenous Studies Initiative. Also at Brown, we're all at Brown. Leela Gandhi is a literary and cultural theorist whose research and teaching focuses on transnational literatures, post-colonial theory and ethics, and the intellectual history of the 19th and 20th centuries. She's director of the Pembroke Center and John Hawkes Professor of the Humanities and English. And then at my extreme right, which is where she is not normally found, is Thangam Ravindranathan, a literary scholar whose interests include 20th and 21st century literature and critical theory, narratives of travel and space, the contemporary novel, the question of the animal, literature, and ecology. She is also a professor of French and Francophone studies here at Brown. So I'm not going to say more than that. I'm going to allow Mohammed to begin with some comments and then pass it over to the panelists. And if I need to referee, I'll come back. Otherwise, I'll stay and listen, which I hope you'll do. Thank you.
Okay. So hello, everyone. Thank you. Thank you all for being here, especially on a Friday. I'm going to begin, by thanking everybody. Of course, my colleague, for taking the time to, read this book and to engage with it. But also, I would like to thank, my department, because without them, this event would not have taken place, and also to thank our partners and for supporting this event, the Kogut Institute for Humanities, the Center for Environmental Studies, and of course, last but not least, the Center for Middle East Studies at Brown.
And the Kogut Center.
I think I said it at the very beginning. Yes, I said institute, but it's an institute. Because sometimes you don't know institute, center, institute. I hope I got this kind of okay. Okay, so, but I would like to thank particularly Thangam Rabindranatham, because she really organized this and made it, possible. And also, that wouldn't have been possible without the support and help of our administrative team, especially Olivia Urcioli and Candace. So my task today, and I'll try to be short, is to try and describe this book, which is a kind of labyrinth with several entry points. So I'm going to try and find at least one, and to describe certain concepts, mainly one, which is something a bit different than simply stating arguments, which maybe we'll do later on. So I'm not going to give a definition of that concept, because for me a concept is rather, and I mean not an essence, but an operator with specific functions within the act of describing several intertwined materials, which is what I call a concept, which most of these materials in the book are historical. And the first of these concepts, and maybe I'll only have time to describe what I mean by this concept, is imperiality. So imperiality is not the same thing as empire, not the same thing as colonialism, not the same thing as imperialism. So it's different, it's intertwined, it's interconnected with all these phenomena, but it's a bit different, and I'd like to explain why. Imperiality comes into play when a human power asserts that its power is either that of God or of God's representation on earth. So instead of referring to this absolute dimension of power in vague terms, such as, for example, religion, or to the ill-formed concept of theocracy, I propose to call this theological political dimension of power imperiality, to name the fact that we, or one, needs an emperor to assert that earthly power is the image or the vicar of God's power on earth. Imperiality, or the imperial dimension of power, is the mediator, if you will, between heaven and earth. So in other words, the concept of imperiality has the function, in my view, of reconfiguring, that is to say, both deconstructing but also reconstructing the field of research known as, quote unquote, political theology. For there to be a transfer from heaven on earth and from heaven to earth, for the state to construct its sovereignty as the supposed image of God's sovereignty, there must be an emperor. So to be able to say that all the key concepts of the modern state are secularized Christian concepts, one has to acknowledge first that they can be secularized concepts to the extent that they are first imperialized Christological schemes. So of course, imperiality is also a process, and this is why sometimes I'm trying to talk in the book about imperialization, or the imperialization of power. The singularity of the Western trajectory of imperiality stems, in my view, and this is also something specific, from the absence of one empire, or the empire. So to some extent, imperiality begins, hence it's spectral, begins when the empire is made impossible in Western Christendom. So the history of imperiality, if there is such a thing, in fact, of colonial imperiality, stems from the impossibility of unifying Western Christendom through and as one empire since at least the Reformation. So as Western Christendom, something different than just Christianity, fragmented after the Reformation, each sovereign claimed the imperial title against other sovereigns. A typical example of this dynamics of what may be called conflicts of imperiality, is the very famous sentence, "This kingdom or this realm is an empire," which came, in fact, from a translation, which is a translation of a medieval French sentence, "Ce royaume est un empire." So why do I say that, you might ask? I'm saying this because I think there is a certain kind of historical dialectics which is not reducible to most of the terms we've been used to, that is to say either modernity, Christianity, and so on and so forth, but something a bit more, maybe a bit more precise in this, which is that what we call colonialism has been haunted by a specter, which is both a Roman and Christian imperial specter, and that it's haunted by something that it makes impossible in the meantime. This is why, and what I'm trying to say is that what we call imperial and what we call colonial are deeply intertwined since at least 1492, but they're not the same thing. So in other words, imperiality structures colonialism, which disseminates and fragments imperiality itself. And to say that is not to argue that all power, all forms of power, both in the West and beyond, functions on the basis of a totalizing coloniality. It means that one should rather maybe at least talk about zones of imperiality in both the metropoles and the colonies, which means that this would allow us to understand Western or modern also, Western modern forms of sovereignty as circulations between the metropoles and the colonies without saying that there has been a sort of internal colonization of Europe itself. A few examples. The German word, Reich, means empire. The first stable regime to emerge from and after the French Revolution was the first empire, the Napoleonic Empire, le Premier Empire. The double-headed eagle is maybe, as some of you know, a medieval imperial symbol, but it's still present in present-day Germany. What I call secularization is an effect of something more specific than simply imperiality itself. It's an effect of the dialectics between imperiality and its fragmentation as colonialism through colonialism. Hence, one of the stakes of the book is to try and question the idea according to which Europe alone, indigenously, if you will, created modernity, by which I mean in an endogene way, that is to say, by assuming that Christianity sort of led to its own dissolution by a sort of internal logic, is what is criticized by this book. This, in my view, at least for most of the narratives of secularization that have been rightly criticized since at least 2 decades, I would say, roughly. The problem with what we used to call the secularization thesis or the secularization narrative is that it presupposed that Europe secularized itself. And this book is trying to say something else, is that secularization is an effect of the interactions, imperial interactions between the metropoles and the colonies. That is to say, what happened to Europe when Europe went abroad to embody this dream of empire that was made impossible by the Reformation. And secularization also means or refers to what happened when it came back to Europe. So the other thing I would like to say, if I do have some time, is that I do not presuppose that there is such a thing as secularization. That is to say, my assumption is not to assert the existence of such a process, and certainly not to, argue, because I tend to argue the opposite, that secularization would be, of course, a decline of religion. This is, of course, not what I'm trying to say. My point of departure is to describe as much as possible that the actors of industrialization claimed, the actors themselves, that their action was the realization of Christianity on earth, be it the kingdom of God or the supposed essence of this religion. So it's the actors themselves who say, we are making Christianity up on earth. So secularization as an enunciation belongs to the facts themselves, if you will. It's not just a concept that is external, it's something that the actors say about what they're doing. Okay, so there is a last point I want to try and make, which is this relationship to climate, which really came as sort of last step in the making of this book. And really, I think the reason why I made this argument is because of capitalism. That is to say, I was, told, well, this is very nice, but what is material about that, right? And where is capitalism? And one of the answers to that question that was, asked by friends and colleagues and comrades and so on, my answer would be that the secularization of empires, or the imperiality of secularizing processes, is part of the initial accumulation of capital in general, but of fossil capital more specifically. That is to say, so of course I'm using a deliberately Marxian vocabulary, but I think it's kind of strange that what Marx used to call the critique of heaven, critique of religion, if you will, that this critique of heaven has not been seen as being part of the problem itself, or as being part of the ongoing process of dispossession that makes capitalism, that is not reducible to capitalism itself. So this is why, in the end, I'm trying, by using these concepts, both imperiality and secularization, to clarify what we call state violence, and which is, I think, a reducible element or dimension of the processes that made capitalism possible, and therefore that are not reducible to capitalism itself. So one of the ways of, I suppose, summarizing, as we say, with this book is trying to bring to the conversation, would be the following one, or at least a question. The question goes like this: if we asked the earth if she agreed, or it or he agreed, to bear the burden of heaven, would the earth accept that burden? And the answer of the book is no. But of course, beyond answering the question, what is interesting, in my view, is to try and say that precisely, historically speaking, the earth has been asked to bear the burden of heaven, and that destroyed the earth itself. I guess the main argument from a historical point of view that allows this kind of formulation to be enunciated is that the book is trying to describe what and how, or rather how, colonialism changed, transformed, morphed during the 19th century. And the opening sentence of that book is a very strange and troubling sentence, which is the one that Napoleon proclaimed in Egypt in 1798. instead of saying, we are going to convert you to the true religion, which is supposed to be Christianity, Napoleon said, we are true Muslims, we the French. Beyond the idea according to which this sentence would be a pure manifestation of opportunism, the idea of the book is that this sentence manifests something that might be called secularization to the extent and provided we completely redefine the very meaning in grammar of that concept, secularization. I just want to end by saying that this book is sometimes, when it's not read, it's sometimes considered as a criticism of secularism. But something I would like to say to prevent also maybe certain misunderstandings is that this is not a book about only secularism and not a criticism of secularism either. Precisely because it is much more a critique not only of heaven or of earth, to use certain Marxian expressions, but a critique of heaven on earth, which is different. Meaning that what I'm trying to describe as secularization is the matrix of both certain forms of exclusionary secularism, but also certain forms of political religions as they are deployed today since the 19th century onwards. So, this is a gesture of double critique, which is a sort of neither religious nor secular form of discourse, if that is even possible. So thank you very much. I hope I was not too long. And, let's begin.
It's loud. So it's my absolute pleasure to speak about our new colleague. Maybe that word is in doubt. Our colleague, Mohammed's amazing book, The States of the Earth, which, as David mentioned, was recently translated into English. And it's an honor to be here. And I will admit to feeling quite outclassed on this particular panel. I am a creature of the humble particular, and the theories that I read are usually not very continental. And I'm very, very far from being an intellectual historian like my colleague Holly, or a scholar of religion or its absences, let alone a theorist or a philosopher. And these are perhaps the right people to be thinking with a work that makes such a daring and, to me, very convincing link between the concept of disenchantment of the world, the rise of fossil-fueled industry, and our contemporary moment of climate crisis. Or in your stunner of a phrase, Mohammed, the sacrifice of heaven has overturned the earth. How I do come to this book is in part as a historian who was originally trained to study Russia and the Soviet Union. And I was trained under a historian whose last great work argued that the Bolshevik impulse to change the world was not so much anti-religious, despite their open and regular disdain of the church, but a form of faith. And not just faith, but a kind of millenarian faith, in Yuri Sloskin's interpretation, one in which Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels foretold how the darkness of capitalist exploitation would become the light of communist utopia. And between these poles was a kind of earthly revelation, what socialists called a revolution, but in their minds was also an apocalypse of a kind, on the far side of which was a rebirth into a world purged of suffering, where the last became the first. Mohammed opens the book in what the Soviets would have seen as darkness, literal and figurative, a time in Europe when Europe's minds were haunted by demons, the kobold in Germany or the Tommyknocker in the Cornish mine country. And those demons were active parts of miners' lives not so long ago, part of a shared cosmology where the earth was lively enough to rise and trouble the men who tunneled into it. I think I probably spend more time than many people in this room with contemporary miners, and I'm not sure that the spirits are completely gone, that the Tommyknockers are still around. But I take Muhammad's point to be less about the cosmologies of the working class in their kind of daily lived lives, and more at the spectral elite level of world making and the making of the world that, whether you believe in Tommyknockers or not, you still have to live in. And as this book goes on to argue, it is at such a philosophical level that those demons and their enchanted kin had to die for the contemporary world of extractivism and technology to be born. And it's a thought-provoking move, if one that I think has resonance in the Soviet context, one that makes secularization more a modification of a Western teleological narrative than a diminishment of faith itself, that millenarian idea that time goes in one particular direction. As I read this book, secularization is in part disenchantment, no longer seeing devils at the bottom of the mines, only toxic gas, and part in celebrating that disenchantment as a fundamental sign of progress. Once the devil is gone, the mine can go deeper. The mine that goes deeper yields more to human use. And this is not an eschatological progress about salvation after the final judgment, but something that can be seen on earth, the process that you alluded to, where heaven is no longer something that is confined to an afterlife or a world that is beyond us, but is instead the world that humans create. So instead of the progress of souls, it is a world that is defined by what we might call the standards of living. The ability to consume more of the earth becomes the mark of salvation. So there's no need to wait for heavenly transcendence, and no need for an apocalypse even. Humanity becomes what makes history, shapes the present, and has divine right to the future through the mastery of the material world. But of course, there's a catch. And it's a catch that's in our headlines, rain-soaked and fire-worn, in Hurricane Helene and in India's heat waves, and in ongoing and violent colonial acts, and all the other hells unleashed by and causing a carbon-saturated atmosphere. The catch is that mastery is an illusion. The demon is out of the mind because it was let out and is lashing its tail across the world. The result, as Muhammad poetically puts it, is that the indices of the secularization initiated in the 19th century can be found in the air we breathe and the food we eat, rather than in the study of attendance rates at churches and other places of worship. And to me, that this is at the heart of this truly provocative argument about how it is that we come to kind of deal with and reconcile ourselves to the state of the earth that we live on now. And I'm left with two questions. The first has to do with the Western orientation of this argument, which is not a challenge to have written a different book, but more one to think about the ways in which looking east as opposed to west may or may not provoke different modes of interpretation, particularly around the idea of imperiality, that fragmentation of the capacity for a united church under a single empire, which if you look east happened earlier than the Reformation, when Christianity split into Constantinople and Rome, and two churches that were divided under two empires that understood themselves as holding the one true God, long before Martin Luther put his treatises on the church door. I don't know if that changes things, but I'm curious. Secondly, is thinking about how the kind of forms of secularization, ones that are also racialized, one that are rooted in a kind of imperiality, one that adores fossil fuels and industrial burning and wants to drive the demons out of the mines, must always end up in a capitalist form, or if that is a byproduct of other kinds of contingencies. And to me, one of the strengths of this book is its continual refrain and emphasis on the necessity of recognizing the contingency of the world that we live in now, the capitalism that has come to dominate how we kind of organize ourselves. But I wonder, in this view, and if sort of looking east outward from these ideas, where the Soviet Union, with its deep commitment often to imperial undertakings and an unbelievable commitment and adoration of fossil fuels and kind of creating the kingdom of earth on heaven quite explicitly, if that again has anything to say about the states of the earth and the contingencies of how we got to this current one. And I wonder too, in that kind of thinking, whether or not capitalism becomes less the kind of natural byproduct of this kind of thinking, of the sort of transformation of Christianity from a process of our cosmology into something that is there to be manipulated as part of our material manipulation of the world. And if there is something in looking east that might add to the ways that we think about that. And I say this as a historian who's quite sympathetic to and indeed committed to identifying the commonalities between these ideological and economic systems, but also as a historian, I'm interested in those particulars. Does it matter, in other words, what the kind of content of the goal of progress is, if it is supposed to be the accumulation of wealth or if it is supposed to be the creation of equity? Perhaps another way of asking this question is, are there worlds now or were there in the 20th century outside of the disenchanted one? And my second question is about exhaustion, not about mine, even though it might be showing because it's Friday afternoon. But I spend a good deal of time on what I think of as the solutions side of campus, the one where climate problems are supposed to be met with technology and the market, that is, with those human laws of history, with progress made manifest on Earth. And so I spend a lot of time in rooms where people use words like innovation and growth and market potential that often have the pro forma tinge of a late Soviet recitation of dialectical materialism. They are what we are supposed to believe in. But the graphs of basic biogeochemistry indicate otherwise. Carbon dioxide is still rising, and the gains from emission reduction from wind power and the like is consistently undone by increasing and now artificial intelligence-driven energy demand. I do not teach students who can sustain faith in even an illusion of progress as their homes are on fire or floating away. So the demon doesn't seem like it's going back in the mine. So my question is, what is the world that comes after the disenchanted one? Is it re-enchanted? Is it re-enchanted by what to me seems like the most immediate and terrifying form of re-enchantment, which is a kind of blood and soil romanticism, which harkens back to a moment of gender norms through trad wives on TikTok or the specter of Haitian immigrants that are called up on our national debate stages, which are reaching back and asking us to imagine the demons in the mine, even if they're not fully believing in them, and I think come from this place of exhaustion. But I wonder if that's the only option, and what thinking about the creation of the states of the earth and the conflation between the state we live in and the state as a political entity that Holly just gestured to might tell us about other alternatives. Thank you.
Thank you. One, I'll speak in points in the hope of brevity, though I'm familiar with places where the point form is the invitation to interminability. So, two. Although Edward Said's 1978 epochal Orientalism covers Europe and the West at large, it is mainly about how something we can call the modern imperial worldview achieves exemplarity amongst the French and the British, in that order. Unlike the Americans, Said writes, unlike the Germans, Russians, Spanish, Portuguese, Italians, and Swiss, the French and the British have Orientalism, are Orientalism. 3, And yet, in the academic and imaginative aftermath of Said's Orientalism, until fairly recently, when we started to think of empire, imperiality, as a trans-chronological and trans-geographic disposition, it was the British Empire that became the paradigm for modern empire. Tout coup. France more or less fell away in the uptake, notwithstanding the salience of French imperialism in the contemporary Middle East and its continuation to this day in various so-called French overseas collectivities and territories. 4. Some of this obviously has to do with language and expertise. Said's English language book unfolded as post-colonial studies, primarily in the Anglo-American Academy. 5. But at least some of the inhibition about France may have to do with the brilliant but limited scope of Edward Said's heuristic for empire. By his familiar account, modern imperialism is no more, no less than an epistemological project, augured by the European Enlightenment and tethered to the grammatical epistemic unit of discourse, which anticipates anything at all that might be thrown up by the ponderous, formidable materiality of the world. 6. You'd think, as Said does, as Isaiah Berlin did, that this is the story of how the French Revolution, with a little bit of help from Napoleonic organization, imperialized the world. But something about the comprehensive taxonomic mode of British imperial governance took center stage. All eyes were on the alleged and unique bookishness of British imperialism, its barter of knowledge for conquest, Shakespeare for trees. The anti-colonial nation-state was declared the dubious heir to, or mimicry of, a project of rule by discursive means. Anti-colonial rebellions against colonial and proxy anti-colonial states made the cut only as anti-epistemological subaltern projects of unintelligibility. 7. But there are some procedures that the sins of discourse alone does not quite cover. For example, colonial powers and anti-colonial nation-states across the world flexed global political influence with their nuclear weapons program, with France at the helm. Of the 210 French nuclear tests between 1960 and 1996, 17 were in the Algerian Sahara, most after Algeria gained independence. 193 were in French Polynesia. Our foe will be the earth itself, Arundhati Roy wrote presciently when India conducted its own 1998 nuclear test in Pokhran, Rajasthan. 8. Discourse does not reveal this enmity with earth at the heart of imperiality, but secularism does. Muhammad Amer Meziane argues in his extraordinary book, The States of the Earth. 9. In a series of dazzling analyses, for those of you who haven't read the book yet, Meziane swaps out the Saidian heuristic of epistemology, tethered to the unit discourse, for a radical new conception of secularity, tethered to the unit extractivism. Several things appear. A signature of the French imperial project included This secularism does not mean the death of religion. It is a transfer of sacredness from the heavens to earth, yet one that does not make the earth sacred so much as profane. It is a nomos of the earth, Carl Schmitt called this in 1950, that bequeaths to Christianity alone a theological, political, terrestrial form of sovereignty, a right to enjoy heaven on earth by way of unlimited access to planetary resources, incorporating human resources. Its coordinates are the 1798 to 1801 Napoleonic invasions of territories in Egypt and Syria, the 1830 French invasion of Algeria, the establishment of the Napoleonic Civil Code. It is built on the ruins of the Ottoman Empire. It renders Islam the exact opposite of secularity, that is irremediably and inalienably theocratic, the dominion of a merely transcendent God whereon earth becomes resource bereft. 10. Now, the specificity of French imperialism is perhaps somewhat better delineated, as is the toxic heritage of those 213 tests among 2,121 others by world powers. Our foe will be the earth. 11. But if unintelligibility, a politics of unintelligibility, is no longer available as the privileged riposte to a generalized project of imperialism, of imperiality, then what? 12. In a beautiful talk delivered last year here at Brown, at the Kogut Institute, which I saw online, Muhammad proposes cosmos as a possible rejoinder to secular. This concept, he says, refuses precisely a contingent understanding of earth as the other of heaven at the crux of secularity, alongside other cognate divisions, e.g., immanence, transcendence, finite, infinite, physical, metaphysical, being, non-being. Cosmos, he clarifies, is the name for the form of life that appears upon the dissolution of all such divisions. He draws upon the concept of barzakh, or isthmus, a non-contradictory in-between, reanimated in the thought of the 19th century Algerian military leader, Islamic scholar, and Sufi, Amer Abdelkader. 13. The concept barzakh also appears in the work of the 12th century Andalusian philosopher-mystic Ibn Arabi. In his Kitab al-Tajalliyat, it is described as a subset of the concept of tajalli. The word is sometimes taken to mean theophany. Arabi uses it to elaborate the beautiful Hadith Qudsi of the hidden treasure, which is about the revelation that the divine is only knowable as manifestation, that is, as the dissolution of heaven in the human heart and as the world. Tajalli is, in one reading, the postulation of the inviolability of manifest existence, and thereon of such existence as the only knowledge worth having. 14. Edward Said once called this secular criticism. 15. In the light, and I mean light as in luminous, of Muhammad's generative work, I thought again for a moment of the 19-member pacifist Sahara protest team, variously from Nigeria, Ghana, Basutoland, but also the US, Britain, and France, who unsuccessfully, in the wonderful way of pacifist projects, unsuccessfully, but powerfully, undertook a journey in December 1959 to the site of the first French nuclear test in Algeria, in Regan, some 1,000 kilometers south of Algiers. Their aim was to literally put their bodies in the place of the explosions when they happened. This attempt to defend Earth by becoming undivided Earth is Cosmos, Barzakh, Tajalli, and maybe just a little bit a subterranean form of secular as well. 16. Thank you, Mohammed, for the gift of what you've made possible both to protest and cherish.
Okay, hello everyone. Can you hear me? Yeah. So I am not, as the program might suggest, Adi Ophir, who unfortunately for unforeseen reasons cannot be with us today, but he wanted me to convey to Mohammed especially how important and fascinating he finds your book, and he would have liked to be with us. So can I just quickly repeat my my heartfelt thanks to my own department, to the Center for Middle East Studies, Center for the Environmental Humanities at Brown, and the Kogut Institute for this event, and most of all to these respondents. I've just been really enriched already hearing how your different minds have encountered this incredible book. So, with no further ado, my response is called "For Lack of Dragons." So these are, sorry for all this. These are hard acts to follow, and this was a challenging book to read. So this is the due modest preface to my talk, as others have done with theirs. I'm neither a philosopher nor a historian, nor certainly a philosopher of history. I am a thinker of literature. I thought the book was going to be about demons and dragons, so I signed up. It may be because I read the opening. Not so long ago, European miners still thought that demons inhabited the underground world. They thus anticipated dreadful encounters with such demons each time they worked in those subterranean labyrinths called mines. The story indicates that massive extraction of underground resources on a global scale would not have been possible without a disenchantment of the soils and the subsoils. That is the opening to the preface to the English edition of States of the Earth. Of course, one must never judge a book by its first sentence, so I also picked a random place in the second half of the book and found my suspicions confirmed. This is a 2-page section titled Underground Dragons, where Mohammed goes from the pre-modern fears of miners in England to those of the natives of Cochinchine, or French Indochina, today's southern Vietnam, circa 1880. A Mandarin declared to the chargé d'affaires of the governor of Cochinchina that a dragon lived beneath the earth. Imperiality immediately reduced the declaration to an easily identifiable theme: the superstition of dragons. What the governor's chargé d'affaires described as a superstition was presented as a major obstacle to the exploration and extraction of coal. We can be sure that on occasions it'll be impossible to exploit some seam whose concession we demand, as some additional dragon will be imagined, whose inviolable retreat it is. Later, the same governor would try to reason with the minister, taking the example of mining in Europe. We had dug into the soil in all directions without encountering even the smallest dragon, and without these excavations causing any cataclysm. The Mandarin objected that the Chinese shared the same superstition, and that it was for this reason that they had suppressed the construction of railroads on their territory. the chargé d'affaires concluded with these words, "I imagine that for his part, he thinks that it is for lack of dragons that Westerners are barbarians, or vice versa." Mohammed goes on to write, the fossil economy implied a profane readability of the underground world, liberated from all superstition. Dragons had to cease to exist so that underground empires could unfold. In the form of geological and mineral exploration, secularization was also a condition for the ideal appropriation of the earth and its subsoils by industry. These two moments, it turned out, were the only two mentions of demons or dragons in Mohammed's book. But still, I will insist, and not just because I need this to be a book about demons and dragons, and I think Bathsheba and I agree it is, because these are less frightening to me than history and philosophy. But I would say demons and dragons are the core of the book, its deepest place, its innermost breath and fire, its beating heart, to use an expression Mohammed or Mohammed's translator seems to favor. This is a wager of a book. It is a book that wants to think it all: colonialism, empire, or imperiality rather, secularism, secularization, religion, race, capitalism, fossil fuels, demons and dragons. It asks the question of how all these connect and elaborates the answer in a way that is magisterial and erudite, the unearthly voice of philosophy of history, but also unstable, kaleidoscopic, turning, returning, restarting. It is a book that confronts us with paradoxes. Napoleon is Muslim before he is Christian. The secular produces and proliferates religion on the ruins of the divine. The secularization of Christianity is Christianity's fulfillment on earth. Saint Simonianism calls itself a religion, but it is an exit from religion, whereby the divine becomes the liberation of man from the divine through industry. The Egyptian expedition fails, as does Saint Simonian association and even coal mining in Algeria, yet both anticipate and shape the forms of imperiality that succeed and supplant them, namely settler colonialism and fossil capitalism. A paradigm is identified in the Egyptian expedition. This is the last of my paradoxes. A paradigm is identified in the Egyptian expedition, yet this is not where it starts at all. It starts much earlier, in the inter-imperial rivalry between Britain and France, where at every turn, in what could be called a fuel race, it is because coal fuels naval and military power that it also underwrites industrial and economic power, through the agency of a secular fossil state that neutralizes, through assimilation, association, regulation, abstraction, every power that opposes it. Secular fossil imperiality, argues Mohammed, is fundamentally counter-insurrectional in its historical thrust and in its dynamic. And its historic and paradigmatic other is Islam, an alterity that it refuses, that secular fossil imperiality refuses to consider as political, ethico-juridical, or metaphysical truth, but reduces to what it calls religion, confined alternately to violent theocracy or mere personal law governing marriage, costume, and food, with no powers to protect its believers from massive material and terrestrial expropriation. Through determining loop effects between ideal and material strata, a secularist, tolerant, ethnographic abstraction of other worlds and other beings facilitates the extension of Europe's power in the colonies to their subterranean mineral depths. The original French title is Des empires sous la terre, or of underground empires. This is, in a sense, the material history that has been waiting to be written since Edward Said, that would describe the material and ecological underside to the discursive and representational formation that was Orientalism. I note that this book, by virtue of several of its features, works against the grain of decolonial gestures of our times, or even the subaltern histories of recent times. First, for all its axiomatic interest in ecology, this is a philosophy of history, and as such, it maintains the tale that it tells on the level of conceptual and ideational formations, even enunciations, as Mohammed called them, and their role in giving sense and force to institutional and material processes. There is a handful of characters here, historical characters, who think and say things, notably Napoleon, the Emir Abdelkader, the Saint Simonians Barthélemy Prosper Enfantin, and especially Ismaël Urbain, fascinating characters and especially fascinating enunciators. But the part that they play is foremost as agencies through which thought moves in the world, with the power or lack thereof to shape what is possible at different times. And the polemos of the book, while it has real effects for peoples and lands, is one that is analyzed on the level of a struggle of conceptualizations of world. The second feature related to the first is Mohammed's apparent disinterest in identifying, and I think a couple of panelists have referred to this, his apparent disinterest in identifying loci of resistance or resilience as such in opposition to imperial, secularist, and ultimately fossil power. And I want to say that in many ways, Mohammed's next book, which is his last book, in a sense, his more recent book, Au bord des mondes, actually is doing that work of taking things from the other side, which is really quite fascinating, and we'll have to wait for that to be translated into English. So the notable exception to this apparent disinterest in the locus of resistance is the extraordinary few pages devoted to the Emir Abdelkader. And I won't say much more about this, but maybe you'll talk about it. And I know that Lila noted this moment too. And the extraordinary quote there are several extraordinary quotes from this militant and Sufi poet. So to quote this one, "For us to confront all the forces that march behind you would be folly." This is him addressing empire. "For us to confront all the forces that march behind you would be folly, but we will exhaust them, we will pester them, we will destroy them selectively. The climate will do the rest." Very, very sort of fascinating and tantalizing reference there to climate, which I hope you will say more about. The assertion and narration of resistance is not the point in Mohammed's book. The insistent, resounding, tireless question is rather a how, and its concern is the massive totalizing logic of something that has seized the entire globe. How did its parts concatenate over time? Through what states of affairs? Through what contingencies and what mutations? The third feature is of a piece with the other two. It is the remarkable subtlety of the actual indictment of imperiality. This is a book whose anger is sublimated into analysis, whose terms are not righteous, because it takes for granted that the past is known, as is the present. The question is what deeper logics made it all possible, and how to position the inquiry, not to say an eventual intervention, on that level of the deepest logics. Of course, there is discussion here of what systems of thought led to massive dispossession of peoples, but it is rare to find words that outrightly accuse. I was interested to find this sentence, and there are a few, but I was interested to find this sentence precisely in the very last pages of the book, describing the trick of, I don't have it, sorry. I was interested to find the sentence in the last pages of the book, describing the trick of secularization. Quote, "Secularization, in Hegel's account and in the eyes of his disciples up to the present day, is a call to return to the world, to the real that we had lost through the Oriental invention of a single and transcendent God. But the call to cease fleeing the world assumes that subjects are strangers to the world, that they must be integrated to it willingly or by force. This world, at the heart of which the colonized are excluded by race and life on earth is threatened with extinction, is presented as the only real world, and as this world in opposition to other worlds of theologies." So that is, in a nutshell, the logic of secularization as described by Mohammed. The phrase, "at the heart of which the colonized are excluded by race," is arguably the one in the book that most bluntly names the catastrophe wrought by Western imperiality. I should say the whole thing, "at the heart of which the colonized are excluded by race and life on earth is threatened with extinction." I note with interest, though, that the French original evoked the colonized not as being excluded by race, but as being frappé d'irréalité par la race, or struck with unreality, made unreal, made unworldly, unworlded by the category of race. which is the description of an operation of ontological desubstantializing, deeper and graver than mere exclusion, and provokes us to imagine the immensity of the work that it would take to counter it, an interminable deconstruction. On a lighter note, arguably, I decided while reading this book that its unexpected literary counterpart was no, not Zola's Germinal for its coal mines and worker strikes, though that would be relevant too, but a novel written 13 years before that, Jules Verne's Around the World in 80 Days. Le Tour du Monde en 80 jours. In that novel, as you will remember, a phlegmatic British gentleman by the name of Phileas Fogg embarks on what he calls a mathematical tour of the world in 80 days in the company of his French valet Passepartout. The wager is premised on steam power, on how fast, via steamships and steam-powered railways, the pair can travel from London around the world, via Italy, across the Mediterranean, then through the Suez Canal, which had just been built three years earlier, down the Red Sea, joining the Indian Ocean, then crossing the breadth of India, and then the Pacific and the Atlantic back to London, all in 80 days. And there's a lot of betting going on this, on the success of this journey. Rereading this book now, we see how it may have been influenced, as some critics suggest, by Saint-Simonianism. It is an ode to steam, and therefore to coal, to the vanquishing of underground dragons and demons, as well as the conquering of vagaries related to terrain, to weather, or to opposing worldviews. The ships stop repeatedly, and only when rereading this book, I noticed this. The ships stop repeatedly for hours at coal filling stations along the way. These coal filling stations are assured by imperial expropriation of underground mines through the Middle East and India. The Anglo-French pair references wittily the inter-imperial rivalry and mimicry that intensified the fossil power of the European states. And most importantly, the lands and peoples encountered along the way are subject to the secularizing abstraction of empire. They are flattened, exotic, ghosted landscapes, which the gentleman traveler sends his valet to visit, while he plays whist with other gentlemen in his cabin. At one point, stopping in Bombay, Phileas Fogg and Passepartout suspect that they have been served not country rabbit as the menu had promised, but cat meat, at which point the unperturbable gentleman departs from his usual laconism to remark against the protestations of the maître d', "Be so good, landlord, as not to swear, but remember this, cats were formerly considered in India as sacred animals. That was a good time." So really in this novel, extraordinarily, one can see the secular industrial ideal involving an irreducible sort of detour via the whole globe, coming back to itself in order to be what it is. And there'd be more to say about the book and its ending. Anyway, I entered the last moment of my response now, which is in some ways a series of questions for Mohammed. This book is, Mohammed writes, in the foreword to the English edition, a material history with metaphysical consequences. A material history with metaphysical consequences. I have stumbled repeatedly on this opening, thinking to myself, is it not the reverse though? Is it not a metaphysical history, or at least an idealist history, a history of ideas, with material consequences? Indeed, a few pages later, he writes that climate upheaval is the index of reality of secularization. Surely this book describes how certain ideological formations, secularism, imperial ambition, racism, blind faith in science and industry and in capitalist profit, with Saint-Simonianism standing as the standard bearer for some decades of these formations, led to massive land appropriation and extraction of fossil fuels, amongst other forms of extraction, and what Marxian ecologists today call unequal ecological exchange, which in turn over a century and a half have led to what Mohammed calls here the upheaval of the earth. Surely the argument of the book is that it is the sacrifice of the sky, of the metaphysical, that has led to this hellish physical material destruction of the earth. If Mohammed nevertheless, when writing this English preface, decided to call his book a material history with metaphysical consequences, It is, as I understand it, an invitation to consider the sheer slipperiness of the dialectic of matter and ideas. Mohammed himself, in an essay written after the publication of the book in French, after the publication of the French book, claims that with this book, he wanted to stand Marx on his feet, referring here, of course, to the famous line by which Marx claimed to be standing Hegel on his feet. By this, Mohammed means, I think, that Marx was not sufficiently attentive to religion and to the ontotheological aspects of industry. In other words, that Marx, and the charge extends here to contemporary Marxian ecological thinkers, have been too easily dismissive of the metaphysical, because secularism was an anti-metaphysics, and because it resulted in the upending of the earth. Ecology, if it wants to be a serious critique of fossil capitalism, must step outside the assumptions of secularist modernity and be more analytical, perhaps more risky and philosophical historical, in its reconsideration of the metaphysical dimension of earthly reality. As Mohammed writes, we cannot own, in the new book, Au bord des mondes, which I'm translating loosely here, we cannot own our own belonging to the earth without taking seriously what exceeds the earth. The central paradox, then, to my mind in Mohammed's book is that the human relationship with the earth has always been mediated through the sky, not in the narrow sense of heaven or afterlife, but in the broad, teeming sense of the realm of the unseen, the invisible, the intuited, the inherited, the imagined, the revered, the feared, spirits, gods, angels, souls, dragons, demons, but perhaps also analogies, symbols, metaphors, stories, and other vivid modes of thought. These modes of thought are vital and vitalist in a manner that we may not have sufficiently processed, in that such thinking affords earth and matter the time and space in which to mean, to signify, to be interpreted, mediated, related to, beheld, held close, or held at a distance. To be in the space-time of this sort of meaning is precisely to be not in heaven, but on earth. A question then, is this book a material history with metaphysical consequences, nevertheless, because it opens onto the need to reinvest the metaphysical dimension? Or perhaps the real question is this: is it correct to say that there is something immensely analytically enabling about this moment of crisis, which you liken to hell on earth, precisely because it takes this kind of destruction of earth, of the ground that supports us, for us to look up again at the sky? By which I mean not heaven, but the way that the physical, to be physical, must root itself through the metaphysical. For when matter is made to collapse on itself, it is first commodity and over time, death. And 3 more questions, if I may. Question 2. Your last chapter and epilogue make clear the reasons for the methodology of this book. It is non-linear and unstable because it is describing not a Hegelian history of a single spirit or substance, and we saw this quote earlier on, but it is a history which, as it moves, transforms its agents, the colonizers and the colonized, history and earth themselves, and collects hauntings and differences and returns. Notably, the ghost of imperiality, more spectral than that of Christ, you write, haunts the modern state. You write, it is the voice of a body that speaks only on condition of dying. You diagnose here a kind of ghost of empire that continues to move history. And I want to ask you a kind of pragmatist's question, compelling as this description is, given the moment that we are in and the objectives that seem to be yours, which are to restore ontotheological dimensions to the ecological and decolonial struggle. What does naming imperiality a specter allow you or allow us to do? How would you have decolonial thinking confront this specter? Question 3. You describe here at the core of modernity a relationship between Europe and its Oriental other as one that passes through and sometimes flickers back and forth between different stages or states of terrestrial expropriation and ontological impoverishment, extermination, conversion, assimilation, association, apartheid. What would you imagine as another mode by which the West might relate to the Orient? What other relation might one imagine in a potential philosophy of history? What might we name it? And I'm thinking here, obviously, of Palestine. And finally, you show that secularization and fossil capitalism are in their contingent histories profoundly anti-metaphysical. You show at the same time that they are essentially counter-insurrectional formations. The question then would be, should metaphysics, to which you advise us to return in our history, anthropology, philosophy, ecology, should metaphysics be thought of on the mode of the insurrection? Indeed, can it, in this context, be anything other than insurrectional? That's it.
Well, do I stay here? Do I go there? Maybe I'll go there. Because, you know, I can see you, that's the thing. That's right. Yeah, maybe you can do this here. Okay, so I've learned something, many things, but I've learned something is never write a first sentence in a book. Last sentence in a book. Always write the second sentence, which of course is the first, but you know, if you think of it as the second, then it will save you, right? So, you know, but I tried myself alone by wanting it to be that way. No, I mean, this is partly a joke, but there are many things, probably too many things for me to engage with. I mean, the first thing I can say is just, you know, thank you so many times, and you know, I can't really thank you enough for doing this. I'm going to try and you know, say a few things about all the things that have been said, and I'm losing time while saying it, but yeah. So I'll start with the last comment, and I hope progressively that, you know, I will go back to the beginning of the conversation. Thangam, these are, I mean, yeah, fundamental questions. I don't know if I'm going to be able to answer everything, but to go back to what you said about insurrection, my answer is fully yes. The question is, A, what can metaphysics look like if we go beyond the myth, which I'm trying to challenge, the myth of the death of metaphysics? And this is a myth which is common to, I think, in my view at least, what we call continental philosophy and analytical philosophy. They've done this differently. So Anglo-American and French-German philosophy, but they have assumed very differently, in ambiguous ways, that metaphysics was over and that metaphysics was a name of power, transcendence, or what one ought to get rid of. These images being, of course, I mean, these forms of, you know, these problems being more or less analyzed as the one or specters of God, right? So to some extent, the Nietzschean, but Hegelian before being Nietzschean, idea of the death of God is to some extent a horizon. So I'm trying to challenge this. This is, I would say, the main, not the only gesture, is to question this, because I think that there is an exhaustion precisely in this kind of gesture. One of the things I'm trying to do also is, and this doesn't go against anything, that is to say, I'm not trying to go against decolonial theory, go against postmodern theory, blah, blah, blah. I'm trying, and you know, not that this is going to do anything politically as such, I mean, this book, but I'm trying to think about the fact and think beyond the fact that some of the political divisions of the left are maybe due to certain theoretical divisions that we struggle with. One of them being the front of post-colonial and decolonial theory and the front of anti-capitalism, including Marxism. That is to say, the way in which Marxist scholar on the one hand have attacked post-colonial theory for being focused on culture and for abandoning basically the critique of political economy, so to speak. And on the other hand, of course, post-colonial or decolonial theory accusing Marxism for being merely Eurocentric or a pure sort of course there are different positions, but tendentially being complicit in forms of imperialism. So I'm trying to move away from this kind of division as much as possible without, of course, offering some sort of abstract synthesis. But this is what I'm trying to do. And, because some decolonial theorists have said, and I think rightly so, have pointed that many post-colonial scholars have been indebted to, the holy trinity of French theory, that is to say Deleuze, Derrida, and Foucault. But beyond just saying that this indebtedness is bad because these people are European, I'm trying to think about what this indebtedness has made us impossible, has made impossible to think, right? So this I'm trying to struggle with to clarify that. And I think that some of the things that, if you will, what has been called French theory, sometimes postmodern and therefore post-colonial, I think is premised upon this myth of a death of metaphysics, right? And there is therefore, if you will, shares certain assumptions of the anti-metaphysics I'm trying to question, Said included, if you will. So imperiality. The question you asked about imperiality, what does it help us see, or rather, what does it mean to struggle against it, and so on and so forth? Well, as a spectre, yeah. Well, I guess before I think about, or I respond about the spectre specifically, because I'm not sure I have an answer to that specific question. I'm going to try and be as clear as possible about that. One of the most interesting gestures I've been influenced by and so on. You find that, among Derrida has said things about that, and even though I disagree with the fact that this would be just Christianity, but and other scholars, Assad and a few others, have pointed out rightly so, and this is to some extent the foundational assumption of that book, not something I created, but an assumption, that the concept of religion is part of the problem, or that this is a Western Christian, if you will, I would say imperial Christian Roman construct. This, in my view, is fundamental if we think through the idea instead of simply saying this is a Western projection and that's the end of the story, right? But rather, if religion is too vague a concept, it means that there is an entire field of study which has been called the science of religions. Here we call it religious studies and so on, which is a field of study which has been central to the very making of the human sciences, the humanities, and the social sciences, because the very possibility of defining religion as this or that has structured the way in which we have been able to conceptualize society as a certain kind of reality. So I'm trying to say that we have to unpack religion as a concept and use other concepts, other ways of describing certain historical moments and certain forms of reality, certain forms of violence as well. Imperiality names this. That is to say, it's a way of saying that when we talk about the crusade as religious violence in general, when we talk about the Reconquista in general as religious violence and so on, I'm trying to just use another word that will help us see something else, and that will help us see how certain forms of power within quote-unquote monotheism come from the dispossession and the exclusion, if you will, of what these monotheistic traditions could have been or have been, but were not able to be. So in other words, I'm trying to question the fact that the very declaration of oneness is as such a problem, but rather that the imperial declaration of oneness as being God equals kingdom, and kingdom equals God. God is a king, the king is a god. This is a much more specific gesture that is certainly not reducible to either religion or monotheism, right? So one of the things I'm trying to do is to question the kinds of discursive assumptions we have, and that have in fact shaped the very horizon of emancipation that we have named the death of God or the end of metaphysics. So yes, for sure, this is an insurrection in my view. I mean, I don't see how this can be otherwise to some extent. So this is not a restoration, just, you know, it's not going back to, because this is a critique of, or a criticism of ontotheology. So what does metaphysics look like if we're beyond the notion that there is a supreme being and multiple realities that are dependent upon this being, as if this being was to some extent a father? And of course there is a gender dimension to that. I cannot go deeper into that, but this is certainly something that is at stake. So for me, you know, metaphysical means physical, right? So therefore there is a fundamentally embodied dimension of all that. Anyways, yeah, this is, I'm going to try and renounce saying everything I want to say, but about Marx, which also is going to help us, I hope, talk about other comments that have been made by both Holly and Bathsheba. You know, this text of 1844, actually, that Marx never published, which is very famous because Marx asserts that religion can be seen as the opium of the people. Very famous sentence, if not the most famous sentence written by Marx. So Tangam quoted this article, but I'm not going to go, you know, it was published in Qui Parle. It was called How the Critique of Heaven Confines the Critique of the Earth, something like that. And to some extent, this book stems from a dialogue with this text, critical dialogue with this text, specific text of Marx. Marx begins this text by saying the critique of religion, or the critique of heaven, as he calls it, is the condition of all critique. So the question I'm trying to ask is, if we assume, actually, if we take for granted, because one ought to take this for granted right now, that religion is precisely a construction and that there is no such thing as a critique of religion in general that can be assumed as a foundation of critical theory, if you will. So what does the critique of earth, that is to say of both state and capital, look like if it doesn't have the critique of religion as its foundation? That is to say, if we can't say religion is an alienation, therefore capital is another form of alienation, the commodity fetishism therefore becomes a much more complicated thing to say about capital, if only because fetishism is part precisely of a very problematic colonial way of describing non-Western so-called religions, right? This doesn't mean to say that it's the end of Marxism. It means that one ought to ask another question and to deploy the critique of capitalism differently by saying, what does it look like? What does this critique of capital look like if it doesn't begin with the critique of heaven and consider the critique of heaven as part of capitalism itself? So the thing is, of course, the thing about putting Marx on its feet or something like that was about the fact that if you assume that religion is not an object as such, but only that there are only situated religious, social phenomena that capitalism and the state has transformed, it means that most of the religious phenomena we know come from forms of secularization, right? But I want to add something that goes back to what Bathsheba said, is that one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about these dimensions or theological political dimensions, and therefore to centralize the question of secularism and secularization, is precisely because in this specific text, that is to say, when Marx says, and he didn't say that before, because the Jewish question has a very different argument about religion, but when he says religion is the opium of the people, this is precisely when he deploys his own narrative of heaven on earth via the revolution, if you will, right? This opposition between illusionary happiness and real happiness and so on and so forth, right? So therefore, I want to avoid several pitfalls. The first one would be to say, hence Marxism or Marx himself is just part of the problem. But in the meantime, it does explain how certain kinds of anti-capitalism have redeployed certain forms of, if you will, imperial secularization for that reason. And one of the reasons why this is the case is, very simply put, the state. I don't think that Marxism has a theory of the state as such, beyond what Hegel did write about the state, right? Because this introduction I'm quoting and dialoguing with was meant as an introduction to the critique of the philosophy of right of Hegel, right? Hence, of course, this book does not make the philosophical discussion very explicit, but this is precisely what is at stake, because I think that one of the foundations of the problem we face, in terms of critical theory, if you will, or the impossibility or the unsuccessful outcomes of the so-called death of metaphysics, also come from the fact that this very Hegelian specter has not been totally overcome. But this is maybe another question. There are many other things I didn't say, but I was talking about the state because I think one of the arguments behind the book, this is why I'm trying to talk about a fossil state instead of only talking about a fossil capitalism, is precisely because there is a tendency sort of consider that the formation of the state or what the state does would be reducible to an instrument of the capitalist class, right? And even though people don't say that as boldly as they used to, this is still something that remains sort of assumed in many of the eco-socialist literature. So one of the things politically that I'm trying to ask is, instead of seeing the state as only the solution to climate change, what does emerge if we see the state as being part of the problem and not just and only part of the solution? And I think that, some of the things that you said about the Soviet Union and so on and so forth also show us that the problems that the state and state violence poses us are not reducible to capitalism, and therefore the forms of anti-capitalism we have developed are probably not sufficient to sort of challenge the very structure of the state and the specific forms of state violence we're still facing, in my view. Well, there are many other things to say, but the other thing I wanted to maybe at least engage with is this thing about the machine that was quoted by Holly, I think. Part of the argument is that what Marx used to call surplus value, the passage from absolute to relative surplus value, is something that, and I don't think that Marx really analyzed that in details in my view, and he's struggling with something, is the fact that the law, and therefore the state, via the limitation of labor time, actually intervenes and forces capitalism to precisely use the steam engine as a productive force. But the thing is that this is an impure process. That is, it's not just capitalism that is at stake here. It's how precisely the counter-insurrectional dimension of the law itself and the juridical mediation is going to force capitalism to become something else. So we need to analyze these forms, these political forms of governmentality, if you will, of government, as being irreducible. Because if we don't do this precisely, we cannot sort of understand how capitalism transforms, morphs into something else, and so on and so forth. There are many things also to say about the Eastern genealogy that Bathsheba mentioned, but I hope I'll go back to this in a few. Also, I didn't talk about dragons and demons and so on, but I want to say, things about, to respond or to comment certain things that Lila said about Said and so on. This is, I don't know how to say that. This is exactly what was, I guess, at stake in this book, which really came from different moments, different strata, and things about how to transform anger into something else, indeed, in different contexts. One of the things about this book is that it was written partly in France and then partly in New York, right? And the part that was written, so the part written in France was literally a way of making sense of the deployment of a very systemic form of Islamophobia in France and Europe. The fact that the left, and it has changed a little bit since 20 years, let's say. So, maybe some of the things we did collectively with friends and comrades did change the public debate a little bit. But at the time when I started doing this, I was not only disappointed, I was, comment on dit estomaqué? Anyways, I was shocked or something. Estomaqué is something else. It has to do with the stomach, but I guess you got that. By the incapacity, the incapacity of most of my leftist friends and leftist organization to make sense of what was going on. And it's still very difficult to acknowledge that the rise of the far right in Europe is also linked to the fact that there is such a thing as a racism that doesn't appear as racism and racializes religion. And this is precisely because of this, that it is so institutionally efficient. And yes, this is via this question that I started reading Edward Said, Talal Asad, and other Spivak, Chakrabarty. I'm not going to quote everybody, but people that we know as post-colonials, for even though many of them would contest this kind of label. And what happened was this sort of discrepancy, and I realized afterwards that I was wrong, actually, but between the kind of theory that were starting to circulate to sort of analyze the kind, to analyze colonial history, but also, post-colonial effects in the metropole, namely France. And the fact that, as you said, most of the chronologies, the geographies, and so on, that this theory was assuming came from elsewhere. It was either premised upon a very British geography, in which, of course, the colonization of India, to some extent, other parts, some parts of the Middle East, were sort of the central spaces, the sites from which scholars were theorizing. And on the other hand, of course, and this is increasingly the case, the reception of Latin American or South American decolonial theory sort of made the same kind of effect by sort of saying, this is 1492 and we ought to just, reproduce this. So I'm against neither nor the fields. That is to say, I think that this is part of a conversation, but precisely for, if you will, francophone, so to speak, worlds, which are not just francophone, but from the Caribbean, West Africa, and the Maghreb or North Africa, to sort of contribute in the conversation, right? We need to sort of theorize these trajectories and our history differently. Hence, theory, and hence also philosophy, to the extent that what we were calling exemplarity never is only a sort of purely empirical treatment of the archives and so on and so forth. The fact that we begin where we begin, 1492, for example, for instance, the fact that we think about colonialism or modernity in general, which I think we ought to do, but from a specific site, this is not neutral to the extent that this is determined by certain sites from where we speak. So for sure, this is exactly what I was trying to find, and this is an ongoing process, that is to say, how does even colonialism or a history of colonialism look like if we begin in 1798 with Napoleon in Egypt and afterwards in 1830 with the conquest of Algeria? How does it look like, right? And hence Said. You know, Said said something interesting and very important that is almost never quoted, in my view. He says very specifically, or he has to say that to some extent, that during the second half of the 18th century, Orientalism morphed or was transformed in a specific way before it became a sort of colonial discourse. Because before 1798, so the expedition to Egypt, Orientalism did exist, right? Hence, this is why I talk about imperiality and so on. If you want to understand, I don't know, Dante's Hell, you have to read the Monarchia, that is to say, a pro-imperial text that defends the rights of the emperor against the Pope. But this is before colonialism, right? However, there is a later transformation during the 18th century where Said has to say, well, something changed in Orientalism at that time because Muhammad was not the Antichrist anymore. He became the great man, the civilizer of the Arabs, and the lawgiver. And then he says, it was secularized Christianity. So secularization comes before and determines the way in which Orientalism can become a quote-unquote colonial discourse. Inevitability of the concept. But the problem is that precisely when he says that, he is redeploying a concept that has already been thought by centuries of German thought, secularized Christianity. So the gesture of the book is rather to say, okay, there is, if you will, a form of secularization, but instead of only applying the concept to Orientalism, why don't we look to Orientalism to change and reform the way in which we would conceptualize its own secularization, hence Napoleon, if you will. There is something I want to tell you because I think this is important, and I think we should talk more about that if we can. And I've talked about that with a few colleagues and friends, including a very important, in my view, historian who's at Oxford. So when I presented the book there, we talked about that, called Faisal Devji. One of the things I'm trying to do, one of the things is to think differently, and this is not just a question of who comes first. The Sepoy mutiny or revolt, right? If you look at the history of Algeria, most of the processes that are going to be deployed by the British Empire after the Sepoy mutiny, so by the end of the 1850s, were already at stake since 1832 until 1847, that is to say, during the Abdul Qadir's insurrection. The usage of fanaticism as something that would explain his own resistance to colonialism. This is exactly what the British did afterwards. The fact that the insurrection itself, of course, was, I'm calling this, if you will, metaphysical, to avoid saying it's only religious, because it's metaphysical, it's ecological, it's political, it's social, and so on and so forth, without being total for that matter. It's rhizomic, if you will. But what's interesting is what happens on the part of the empires. And this is why, for me, secularization is not one process. I will talk, I hope, about teleology and things about history and so on. It's precisely because it's ongoing, it's unstable, it's multiple, it doesn't go in one direction. And that even though there were secularizing processes in Europe long before, if you will, since the 17th century at least, it's not something that people carry on their shoulders as if, the West is secularized and therefore, colonialism comes here and is already secular. No, nonsense. It doesn't really happen that way. It's that vis-a-vis and in response to these kinds of insurrections, metaphysical insurrections, there was a necessity to secularize the technologies of power, right? As a response, of course, right? Because precisely one shouldn't try and convert them to Christianity because it's going to sort of awaken the logic of fanaticism and so on and so forth. So interestingly, in my view, and this is also one of the responses I got from, I remember a colleague whose name I can't remember, but who was also working on India and colonial India, said, but we never talk about secularization when we talk about the British Empire in India. We talk about liberalism. Right, and I'm simply trying to try and make different geographies meet and be in conversation, but also trying to propose and ask questions in different terms by proposing other concepts also to conceptualize this history. There are so many other things I would like to say, but to go back to something that the material history and the metaphysical, that was Thangam's trap, that very, very nice one. Yes, indeed. I think there is something about discourse that I'm trying to move away from. That is to say, and this also comes from the indebtedness to French theory, right? Which is neither bad nor good, but provokes certain limitations in my view, which is precisely what happens to the history of Orientalism if we move away from just applying a ready-made concept of discourse, right? And the other thing also, which I don't think is very clear in the book, is that one of the dissatisfactions I encountered when I came to the US was the fact that, as opposed to France, it was possible to deploy all sorts of theoretical, interesting, empirical work about places in the global South. But the thing is that I was always struck by the fact that French theory or European theory was considered as toolboxes to be able to describe that. Whereas I was trying to do something different, that is to say, how do we think about the center or the West from a non-Western point of view, which would include, as part of the problem, these very concepts we use to describe the non-West, hence French theory as such as well. So anyways, where I'm very long, yeah, I know. 2 minutes? Well, 2 minutes, and if people can already... Yeah, I think this would be better. Yeah, I know. It's difficult to, but I'll say two things. I'm going to skip the Eastern Constantinople Rome kind of divide. The only thing is, I would say something about this. The kind of fragmentation that happens is different, if only because colonialism is at stake, right? Which I think would change the geography, but even what we call Christianity, I would say, already has an imperial layer before the West becomes the West, if only because, as you said, Constantine has to convert to the religion of Christ, whatever that was, to make the Church of Rome and the Church as we know it possible. So I'm trying just to analyze this layer that is not reducible simply to Christianity. That is to say, you have at least two heads, Rome and Christ, Caesar and Christ, and they never become one thing, right? And when we just say Christianity did this or that, even as as historians, we're sort of talking about something that is certainly not a monolith, right? And so, last but not least, about historicity, I'm trying not to subsume different epochs under one single entity. Precisely, that would be time. But this, to some extent, is not a philosophy of history. I'm trying to say that this is a philosophical history that tries to analyze the concepts we sometimes use or assume, secularization or modernity being some of them, while also talking about history itself. That is to say, trying to think about the history of concepts as or in the materiality that they participate in. But I wouldn't say it's a philosophy of history. I said that I'm trying to say that it opens the way, maybe, I hope, maybe I'm wrong, to another kind of philosophy of history that first would be a philosophy of time, right? But it's in my view a philosophical history, if maybe metaphysical history, that is not, of course, in my view at least, teleological, but it does claim that it's possible to do forms of history that are not only micro or genealogical, without sort of going back to the sort of Hegelian notion of history as totality. So this is the bet, if you will. So thank you.
Okay, well, let's thanks once again, Ali, that's Shiva, Mila, and Agam, and Mohamed. Thank you very much. Thanks to, right this time, Department of French and Functional Studies, Center for Middle Eastern Studies, Environmental Humanities, and the Koga Institute. And I believe there's a reception right next door. So please join us. Thank you for being here, and thanks to everyone.